So what I'm very happy to do with you today is to take a look at what we are understanding about the synodality in the long history of the Catholic Church and globally in this pontificate. And so why this pontificate has been so telling and so important for our understanding of many things of the Church and for synodality in an ecclesiological revival, I would say. And so I would start with this. So I'm an historian and theologian. I strongly believe in multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity. I also believe that there's something very specific for Catholicism, to understand Catholicism, which are two disciplines, history and geography. Back to the classics, if you want. So I think Pope Francis' pontificate has given us a series of very strong messages on the importance of the historical dimension of the Catholic Church, how he has rediscovered a certain message of the Second Vatican Council with a deep historical consciousness, and geography, of course. I don't have to tell you the meaning of having the first pope not from Europe, not from the Mediterranean. Okay, so these are the first two things. And so history is important to understand synodality, because what Pope Francis has done and is doing is to help us retrieve from the past a very ancient concept and institutions, synods, much older than the concept of synodality, which is much more recent, but in a retrieval that is careful in not being restoration. What do I mean by that? So there is a temptation to say, well, we always had synods in church history. Well, that's true, but of a different kind, okay? It's true that we always had in the synods of the ancient period lay people in position of influence and of power. That's true, but they happen to be king, queens, emperor, empresses. So it's a different kind of lay people. Okay, so we are now in a different phase. Second, we had synods in the age of the colonial empires. What is different, and here having a pope from the global south tell us something very important, even when he is not saying anything about this, is that synods and synodality today, they are quite different from the synods that are celebrated in Latin America in the 1600s, in 1700s, for example. Third period in the history of the synods of that period called the Catholic Enlightenment, the 1700s, okay? We had synods, sure, but were synods under the control of the state, often, of the empire again, and we know very clear what Pope Francis has said on the need for the church to be free from interference, to be poor, but not poor just financially poor, but poor means also disempowered from what used to be the church at the service of a colonial empire or of a state until quite recently in some countries. And finally, the synods of the 19th century, what one of my mentors, Jesuit historian John O'Malley, called the long 19th century. It's a long 19th century that begins with the French Revolution, basically, in 1789, and ends with World War II. I mean, 150 years. We had synods there, yes, but there were synods that were an institutional and largely clerical response against liberalism, against the secularization, against everything that was modern. we are now in a different age of synods and of synodality. So I'm not saying that history has nothing to tell us. It has a lot to tell us, but we are in a different moment. And in this, Pope Francis has been very, very good at making a case for the possibility and the necessity of a new synodality in the global church of today. So here Francis has done something very delicate and very complex, which is, without telling us everything about this, because he's KG, because he is a Jesuit, okay? But, I mean, doing something very complicated, which is how to supplement something that was really not there entirely in the Second Vatican Council. It's not the first time a Pope has done that. If we think, for example, what John Paul II did for the dialogue between the Church and the Jews is a very similar thing. He went beyond Vatican II. Okay, so but here Pope Francis has done something more delicate. Why? Because usually, if you ask anyone who's familiar with the Second Vatican Council, and you ask this person, what was the idea of the Second Vatican Council on the Church, you will most often get these answers like a new role for the lay people, collegiality, episcopal collegiality, bishop conferences, and so on. So here Vatican II gave us, or was understood as having accomplished an ecclesiological reform, or according to some, revolution. This was actually an unfinished business. In that, like on some other aspects of the Second Vatican Council. So here Francis, in a way that wanted to look innocent, he has said basically, at Vatican II we had episcopal collegiality, but for the church we live in today, we need to implement collegiality with synodality. And so collegiality is necessary for synodality. Okay, but without collegiality, you don't have synodality. Okay, so this is one of the things. Second, the new understanding of lay people. One of the things that was typical of the Vatican II understanding and image of the lay person was basically a middle-class white man from Europe or North America. A professional with a certain kind of social connections, respected in the church as a professional, as a husband or as a wife. So there's a certain image of what allowed a certain kind of lay Catholics to be seen in the church of the Second Vatican Council, at the Second Vatican Council. Again, if you look at Pope Francis, what kind of people of God, but also people he has in mind, it's not the middle class or wealthy academic white man from Europe and North America. It's not. This is incredibly important. There's something that we have deciphered, decoded in this pontificate. So here, what Francis is doing here are very interesting things. That's why when he was elected 10 years ago, I started waking up much earlier. And it has been like that in these last 10 years, okay? Because something important was happening. One of the things was, Pope Francis, without saying that, again, he was clear that this moment in the life of the church needed a new, a different kind of response to a certain idealization of the Second Vatican Council on the one side, a certain idealization of the new evangelization, for example. This is something very clear. Status quo, not sustainable. This is coming from someone who has gone through two very interesting conclaves, 2005, 2013. We can go into why we have this extraordinary pope after two extraordinary conclaves in sequence, where he played a significant role in both of them, even when he was not elected, which is very unusual in church history. This is a pontificate that has, in my thesis, in my book that was published 3 years ago, is really an interpretation by this Pope of this moment in the globalization of the Catholic Church. As Catholicism, Catholic means universal, and universal and global, they are slightly different or quite different concepts. So here Francis understood and understands that there is a need for a new inculturation, a new kind of dialogue with the global modernity, postmodernity, the disruption of modernity away from the usual pieties of a certain, again, idealization of, in the end, Vatican II will deliver. This pontificate is much more clear on what has not been delivered and what needs to be done for Vatican II to deliver. This is a pope who has really faced, and he's facing, the issues of our time in our disruptive international order and national order, on nationalism, on race, on abuse, on gender, and so on. He's a pope who has given us a lot to think about the relationship between the church and modernity, especially when it's about democracy. I'm reading in these last few days the Instrumentum Laboris for the Synod of October, and there's this thing that, so there's this mantra that the church is not a democracy, which is true. It's not a dictatorship either. So, and here Francis has put us in front of the contradictions of modern democracy. He is not being afraid of doing that, what it means to be nominally equal, when in practice we know that being endowed with the same rights by a constitution doesn't say much about what kind of real rights we have. And finally, he is a pope who has been very clear on breaking a taboo on what is the function of the rules and of the law in the church, where someone were supposed to issue laws and other people were supposed to follow laws, but they were not the same people. And so there is, in St. Peter's Square, there are two statues, one pointing to the far, and the other one pointing down. And so the joke here, we make laws here, but it's for them there to be respected. Right? This is something that has changed under Francis in disruptive way sometimes. And finally, Francis is one of those bishops who has seen the necessity of synodality, because he has seen as a bishop the crisis of the bishops' synod that were an institution created by Paul VI in 1965, And he has really decided to face head-on this semantic, linguistic contradiction. The Bishop Synod created by Paul VI in 1965 have very little to do with synodality. And so there is a process of linguistic clarifications, which is also the problem that the Synod in Rome have now, because we keep calling what's going on in the Catholic Church these days, after 2021 and for the next few years, with the same name that was chosen by Paul VI in 1965, but it's something else. And it's clear that it's something else. Okay, and at the same time, Pope Francis knows that there's no synodality that can work, and actually there's no church that can work without the bishops. There is no possible ways for this church to bypass completely the episcopacy, as a sacrament, but also as a moment for the decision-making process of the church, decision-taking. This is something that we should, I think, be clear about. So here, my last two sections are this. So I think that what Pope Francis has presented us with are risks and opportunities, hopes for the synodal process that come from this opening up of this process, which is to a church that is truly global, as it wasn't at the Second Vatican Council, which is true, was the first and the largest assembly in the world of equals. One bishop from Italy, one bishop from South Dakota or from Sudan, the same vote, one vote. Okay, but all bishops, only bishops. And so now we are in a different moment. Okay, so here there are some risks that, and I really think that we should take them seriously. First, that the synodal element cannot really swallow completely and digest and discard the collegial dimension and the primatial dimension. All, some, one. This is something that is being forcefully recalculated, but this will not become a church without bishops, without bishop conferences, without one position of power. Second, we should really be clear that we might have to check, some idealistic and romantic visions of synodality. So here, this is a church that is going through this at the pastoral level, at the theological level. We will have to check this and implement this with a canonical level. And here Miriam can tell us much more about this. Okay, so this is something that will remain there. We have to think hard about making of synodality in the Catholic Church something that has a strong theological element and canonical that responds to our theology, rather than a purely sociological views of the Church. Why is that? Well, in part because we sometimes fall into this temptation to say the society is free, is good, is dynamic, makes you what you want to be. And the church is the opposite. It's an inversion of the old ideology of the societas perfecta, the church as a perfect society. Okay, so we should but also because in a global church, and Pope Francis has told us that, using sociological models as the only reference for the church means really putting at risk any possible unity of the church. Society in Ireland, in Italy, in China, in Indonesia, in the United States are very different things. So how do you put them together? And so these are some risks, okay, that were obviously there early, and we are entering a crucial phase in these next few months, and I think even after that. On the other hand, this is a moment full of opportunities and of hopes. Now, I have young children, and I am as anxious as one can be about the future, especially having, a young daughter and so on. So I think that we should take seriously the anxieties of our fellow Catholics, what is going to be the outcome of this synod, in terms of instability, of uncertainty. I think this, and I'm quoting Rowan Williams here, the wound of knowledge. Just one sentence. Whatever the social order, the church is still on pilgrimage, and the Christian society is a transitory and ambiguous a phenomenon as any other social form. End quote. So we are in a transition that is very ambiguous, especially if you look at the church from a global point of view. So here we are in multiple transitions that will take many years to sort out and to understand and to discern. We are in a different post-Vatican II age, which, now saying I am a Vatican II Catholic is one of the most vague things that one can say. We are going to find out what it means to be faithful to the Second Vatican Council today. We are in this transition rebalancing a certain deconstructionist project on the one side, and the methods of imposing disciplines of the John Paul II Pope Benedict era. We are trying to make a synthesis of this. I'm reading Instrumentum Laboris, and I have read in these last few days, worried analysis with titles like "Why I'm Not a Liberal Catholic," something like that. Because the idea is of these commentators who have no theology, but they have a big platform, which is all it gets today to be influential in some churches. They say this is a church that is more global under Pope Francis, the poor and the environment and so on, but it has become an ONG. And I'm sorry, I'm still Italian, sorry. An NGO, thank you. So I think there's always been this risk of the church of becoming overly engaged on some other goals but I would say this with all charity that I can, with these anxieties. I would say this. So there are some issues that might look transitional today to us. So when we see this church that is very concerned with what's outside of the liturgy, of the catechesis, of the doctrine, and so on. So these issues and new emphasis, they may be transitional, but they are not accidental. They are transitional, not accidental. And so there's a substance there that we should take seriously. I don't think that one can call for the issue of the role of women in the church a transitional issue. I don't think how anyone can really think this, in 2023, well, this issue will go away. The issue of gender and of transgender, LGBT, these are very important questions. I think that we are using some acronyms in a very, casual way. To be honest, LG is one thing, and then there's the rest. And so we should be very careful, because these are issues that we might use terms that are transitional, but these issues are not accidental. So here, I think that what I think the way Pope Francis has envisioned this and built this the synodal process, which starts from his experience as a global Catholic who never studied in Rome, never worked in Rome, was never part of some circles of the institutional church, is this, and this is a word of hope and of caution at the same time. What I think the global Catholic Church can sustain, can carry, and I don't know if carry, to translate a much more powerful German verb, tragen. Can you bear this? Is first a spiritual process. We need to accept that we are going through a spiritual process, which is not about having visions and so on, but it's about ideas, debates, concepts, arguments, strong arguments, weak arguments, mantras, or real concepts. So it is a spiritual process before then a legislative program, before a policy platform. This is the most difficult thing, I think, in Pope Francis' pontificate, because if you have lived a certain season in the church in these last 30 years, at least, this has been, and I say that with all due respect and love for Mother Church, it's been an age of disappointments, of delayed hopes. So this is the most complicated thing. How to manage expectations of real change, but real change begins with a spiritual and then cultural process before being translated, or while it is being translated into new laws, new institutions, new policies. That must happen. Usually you see that those who don't like Vatican II, they think, well, I'm a Catholic of the Council of Trent. They have no idea of how revolutionary Trent was. The institution of the seminaries for the formation of the priest is a Tridentine institution. The idea of the parish as a territorial unit is a Tridentine institution. So it was hugely innovative, which is not, it doesn't mean liberal, but innovative. Okay. So this is what I think it's important, and again, it comes from a global pope like Pope Francis, who's more global than his successors in a different way, because he has never had a romantic view of the past, of European Christendom, this is really not something that comes from him. So one can be critical on some issues of Pope Francis' decisions, how to implement some of his intuitions, but his intuitions are incredibly faithful to the vision of the Second Vatican Council, meaning not just those texts that one has to know if one has in a position of authority in the church, but what they pointed to, the trajectories that they were pointing to, which is, I think, exactly where we are now. So these are, I really thank you for this opportunity, because that helped me, clarify some of my own questions, my own anxieties, if you want, on the synodal process. And I think I'm done.
Great, perfect.
Thank you very much.